snow fell without mercy. It didn't drift or dance, it consumed. The Russian village lay beneath it like a forgotten photograph, edges burned, faces erased. Charred beams jutted from the ground like the ribs of something once alive. A cradle, blackened by fire, rocked in the wind as if still soothing a ghost. Through this frozen graveyard, a column of German soldiers trudged forward. Their breath formed small clouds that vanished before they could warm the air. Boots struck the ice in rhythm, the march of men who no longer believed in victory, only survival. Each step was swallowed by the snow until even the footprints disappeared. At the rear walked Ernst Müller, the field cook, a man not made for conquest but for kitchens, a baker before the war, with hands used to kneading dough, not carrying rifles. His uniform hung loosely on him, the fabric stiff with frost and fatigue. The ladle at his belt clanged softly against his canteen, a small, metallic heartbeat in the silence. They passed what used to be a home. A doll's porcelain face peered up from the snow, half buried. Ernst slowed, staring at it longer than he should have. A sergeant barked at him to move on. He did, but his gaze lingered over his shoulder, as if the hollow eyes of that doll had followed him. Propaganda had promised them triumph, a swift campaign, banners over cities, grateful peasants handing them bread. Instead, the only bread was frozen hard enough to break teeth, and the peasants, they watched from behind door frames and fences, eyes neither grateful nor hateful, just empty, like the land itself. That emptiness unnerved him more than hatred would have. Hatred had energy, life. This silence had none. It was as if the earth itself had decided to stop breathing. When the column halted, the men rested by a ruined church. Its cross had been shattered by artillery, lying face down in the snow. A few soldiers joked weakly about God having fled east before them. Ernst said nothing. He only looked at the steeple's broken bell, a bell that would never call anyone again. The snow thickened. Somewhere distant, a crow cried, the only voice brave enough to disturb the air. Ernst lifted his canteen and caught a few flakes on its lid. He thought of home, of his wife's kitchen, the smell of yeast and warmth. It felt like a story someone had told him long ago about another man's life. As evening fell, the wind rose, hissing through the ruins like a whispering crowd. The men pulled their collars high, eyes squinting against the cold. The horizon was nothing but white and smoke, and for a moment it was hard to tell which was sky and which was ash. The day ended without a sound. No gunfire, no shouts, only snow landing softly on helmets and rifles. In that silence, Ernst realized this was not victory's march. It was the quiet burial of everything they'd been promised. The kitchen was a tent, stitched together from torn canvas and hope. Smoke leaked through every seam, mixing with the stench of boiled cabbage and diesel. Inside, Ernst stirred a pot that was more water than soup. Shreds of turnip floated like ghosts of real food. Around him, soldiers crowded close to the fire, their faces yellowed from hunger and frostbite. Tin bowls clattered, spoons scraped. The noise was desperate, the sound of men trying to fill the void inside them with something, anything. Outside, beyond the thin wall of the tent, came a softer sound, the shuffle of feet in snow. Villagers. They lingered near the edges of the camp, drawn by the smell. Ernst could see them through a tear in the canvas, mothers clutching children, their faces gray from cold and weeks of hunger. A boy licked at the air as if trying to taste the scent. He looked back at the pot. The soup barely covered the bottom. Even the smell was a luxury now. He wanted to scoop just a little, pour it into something, slip it outside. But before the thought could fully form, a voice cut through the steam. No food for civilians. Captain Weber stood at the entrance. His greatcoat was immaculate despite the mud.
A pistol hung on his belt like punctuation, the full stop at the end of every order. His gaze moved slowly across the room, resting on Ernst. The kitchen feeds soldiers, not beggars. Yes, Herr Hauptmann. Ernst's voice came out low, steady, but he felt something wilt inside him. Weber turned and left, boots leaving perfect prints in the slush, symmetry amid chaos. The men ate in silence now. One cursed under his breath that the portions were smaller again. Another joked weakly that at least the Russians would starve first. Laughter followed, dry, brittle, forced. Ernst didn't join in. He ladled out the last of the soup, scraping the pot clean, and noticed the faint tremor in his own hands. He was hungry too. Not starving yet, but hungry enough to understand the villagers' eyes. As he cleaned the ladle, the wind lifted the flap of the tent again. A child outside, thin as a matchstick, stood watching him. Their eyes met, only for a second. The boy said nothing. Neither did he. He turned back to his empty pot. Steam rose and vanished like warmth escaping from a dying body, and in that thin, fading scent of food, Ernst smelled the difference between obedience and conscience, and how small it really was. Dawn crept in like a reluctant guest, pale, thin, and cold. The camp was half awake, the kind of silence that existed before the day's first orders. Smoke rose from dying embers, curling toward a sky the color of steel. Somewhere, a crow perched on the fence post, cawing once before flying off, as if even it refused to stay here long. Ernst stepped outside the kitchen tent, breath frosting the air. His boots sank into the crust of frozen mud. He rubbed his hands, waiting for the fire to catch, when something caught his eye. A small shape near the edge of the barbed wire fence. At first he thought it was just another heap of snow. Then it moved. A girl stood there, no older than 6 or 7, barefoot, wrapped in rags that might have once been a coat. In her arms she held a doll so frozen that its painted eyes had cracked. She didn't shiver. She didn't cry. She just stared, her face expressionless, her body framed by the frost-bitten wire. For a long moment, Ernst couldn't move. The world seemed to narrow to that small, still figure. He looked around. 2 sentries stood nearby, smoking. They saw her too, but turned away, pretending they hadn't. The unspoken rule was simple. Civilians beyond the wire were ghosts. If you didn't acknowledge them, they couldn't exist. But she existed. Every breath she took proved it. Ernst reached into his coat pocket out of instinct more than decision and felt the hard edge of his bread ration. He hesitated. 1 piece of bread was nothing, yet in this place it was everything. The girl's eyes met his. There was no plea in them, no spark of fear, just a hollow, bottomless kind of quiet, the look of someone who had run out of both tears and expectations. He thought of his own daughter, Greta, back home, how she had cried when he left for the front, clutching her wooden horse. He wondered if someone somewhere was feeding her now. A sharp whistle blew, morning roll call. Ernst startled, his hand snapping back from his pocket. The girl didn't flinch. Captain Weber passed by with his clipboard, eyes fixed forward. He saw the child too. His gaze flicked toward her, then away again. No reaction, no command, just that disciplined absence of emotion that war demanded. As the men lined up, the girl remained at the fence. The barbs caught strands of her hair when the wind pushed her closer. She didn't pull away. Ernst couldn't stop watching. Each second felt heavier than the last. The slogans he had memorized about loyalty, discipline, the fatherland, sounded suddenly hollow, like empty pots clanging in an abandoned kitchen.
And as Ernst turned back toward his pot of soup, he realized that silence could wound deeper than any bullet. It was not defiance, it was truth. Night descended quietly,
wrapping the camp in a darkness that felt heavier than the snow. The wind had stilled, leaving only the sound of boots on frost and the distant creak of barbed wire shifting under the cold. Inside the dim light of the kitchen tent, Ernst sat alone beside the stove, staring at a small piece of bread in his hand. It was his ration, barely enough to keep him steady through the next day. The crust had hardened, the inside dry, but the smell still carried something almost sacred. He turned it over between his fingers, feeling the weight of it, not in grams, but in conscience. Outside, the soldiers laughed faintly from their barracks, the kind of brittle laughter that came only after too much death and too little warmth. Their shadows flickered against the canvas, distorted and ghostly. Ernst waited until the noise began to fade, until the camp slipped into that uneasy stillness between exhaustion and sleep. Then he tucked the bread under his coat and stepped out into the cold. The world outside was blue with moonlight. His breath rose in slow clouds. The snow squeaked softly under his boots as he walked toward the fence. Every step felt like a betrayal, of orders, of discipline, of everything drilled into him, but not walking felt like something worse. The girl was there, just as he'd known she would be, standing in the same spot, small as ever, her doll clutched close. Her face was half hidden behind the wire. When she saw him, she didn't move, only blinked as though her eyes were lying. Ernst glanced back toward the barracks. Nothing, no movement. He knelt, the cold biting through his knees, and pulled the bread from his coat. Slowly, carefully, he pushed it through a gap beneath the lowest strand of wire. For a heartbeat, she didn't react. Then, trembling hands reached forward. Her fingers brushed his glove just for an instant before she took the bread and drew back. They stayed like that for a few seconds, two figures separated by war, united by hunger. The snow drifted between them, glowing faintly in the moonlight. From the shadows near the barracks, a light flickered, a cigarette ember. Ernst froze. He turned his head slightly and saw a figure standing by the window. Captain Weber. Their eyes met through the frost. Weber didn't speak, didn't move. The cigarette glowed once more, then went dark. Ernst waited, heart hammering, but the silence held. No orders, no punishment, only the whisper of snow landing on metal. When he finally stood and turned away, the girl was still eating, slowly, reverently, as if the bread were something holy. Ernst walked back to his tent with empty hands and a full ache inside him. In the language of war, he had just committed treason, but in the language of hunger, he had spoken truth. The fire in the kitchen stove had burned down to embers, glowing faintly like eyes half closed in thought. Ernst sat beside it, his gloves off, palms extended toward the fading warmth. His heartbeat had finally slowed, but the air still felt too tight, as if the night itself was waiting for something. He kept hearing the crunch of boots outside, every step making him flinch. The act had been small, one crust of bread, yet it felt like a crime that could echo through the entire camp. He imagined the report written, the punishment swift. He'd seen men shot for less. The tent flap stirred. Captain Weber stepped inside. His face was unreadable, lit only by the orange glow of the coals. The silence stretched so long that the crackle of the fire began to sound like a voice between them. Ernst stood instinctively, saluting. The gesture looked fragile in the dim light. Weber didn't return it. He only watched. His breath steamed faintly in the cold. Finally, he spoke, his tone quiet, almost weary. "Next time, make sure no one sees," he said. Ernst's mouth opened, then closed again. He wanted to explain, or apologize, or something, but Weber's eyes stopped him. There was no threat in them, no warning, only exhaustion, the kind that comes from carrying too much authority for too long. "Yes, Herr Hauptmann,
Ernst managed. His voice sounded small. Weber nodded once, almost to himself, and turned toward the flap. Before leaving, he paused. The faintest trace of reflection caught in his eyes, something human flickering behind the mask of rank. Then he stepped out, his boots crunching softly into the snow. The tent fell silent again. Ernst sank back onto his stool, staring into the embers. The meaning of the words settled slowly, layer by layer, until he understood them fully. Make sure no one sees. It wasn't permission to stop. It was permission to continue, quietly. The realization warmed him more than the fire did. Outside, the wind rose again, carrying with it the distant clang of metal, the restless murmur of soldiers dreaming uneasy dreams. Ernst leaned closer to the stove, letting the faint heat brush his face. In war, orders were everything. Disobedience was death. But tonight, for the first time, command had bowed its head, not to fear, but to mercy. And in that silence, between a soldier and his officer, humanity had found a place to breathe. The days began to blur into one another, white mornings, gray noons, black nights. The war rumbled faintly in the distance, like a storm that refused to move on. But inside the camp, another rhythm had taken shape, quiet and unseen. Every morning before the others stirred, Ernst stepped into the pale light with something hidden beneath his coat. A crust, a corner, sometimes just a palm-sized piece of bread. The ritual was always the same. Approach the fence, glance left and right, wait for stillness, then lower it gently beneath the lowest strand of wire. And every morning she was there. The girl, barefoot still, but standing stronger now. The first time she had bowed her head in thanks. The second, she had smiled, a small, uncertain thing, fragile as the frost on her lashes. By the third morning, it was habit, a rhythm born of hunger and grace. Ernst began to save what he could. A spoon of flour accidentally spilled during rationing. A crust left over by a soldier who had fallen asleep. A ladle full of soup that didn't quite make it into the pot. He became a craftsman again, not of meals, but of mercy. At night, by the faint orange glow of the stove, he shaped the smallest loaves imaginable, barely more than a handful each, but he treated them like treasure. He baked them when the men slept, the smell rising softly through the tent, warm, dangerous, holy. Somewhere outside, the girl waited in the dark, knowing that warmth would find her in the morning. Each exchange took only seconds, but to Ernst they stretched into eternity. The war faded in those moments. The fence no longer separated German from Russian, soldier from child. It simply divided fear from hope. One morning, when he passed her the bread, she pointed toward the sky, a small streak of sunlight breaking through the clouds. Ernst followed her gaze. It had been weeks since he had noticed the sun at all. The moment was wordless, but it carried the weight of everything he had forgotten to feel. Behind him, soldiers joked about the end of the war, about home, about wives who might not be waiting. Their words drifted away, meaningless against the hush of that brief connection. That night, he wrote a letter he'd never send. I gave bread to a Russian child today. If I'm punished, at least I'll have fed someone truly hungry. He folded it and tucked it into his pocket, as though confession alone could keep him human. The next morning, the ritual continued. The same snow, the same silence, the same exchange beneath the wire. In a world built on orders and cruelty, Ernst Müller, a cook with nothing left to believe in, had found a reason to wake. Kindness had become his rebellion, and repetition, his quiet act of faith. The warning came at dawn, inspection at 10 o'clock. The words passed through the camp like a cold wind. Soldiers scrambled to polish boots that had long lost their shine, to scrub the grime off rifles that hadn't fired in weeks. Even the snow seemed to hold its breath. Ernst's hand shook as he cleaned the kitchen. The pots gleamed with a metallic anxiety, every surface pretending at order. But nothing could hide the truth, the smell of thin soup, the gnawing hunger, the exhaustion etched into every face. Captain Weber moved through the camp barking quiet instructions, coat buttoned, cap precise. His movements were sharp, but his eyes, those weary human eyes, flicked once toward the fence. The girl was there, as always.
The officer stared for a moment, then sneered. Filthy rats breed fast. Soon there'll be more of them than bullets. The words cut through the camp like shrapnel. No one spoke. The soldiers stared straight ahead, stone-faced. Weber's jaw tightened. His salute was mechanical, precise, the gesture of a man swallowing everything he wanted to say. Ernst looked down, forcing his breath steady. The officer moved on, boots crunching away, his entourage trailing like shadows. Only when the car engine faded into the distance did the camp exhale. Weber turned, his eyes sweeping the yard. For a moment they landed on Ernst, a silent warning, or perhaps an unspoken reassurance. At the fence, the girl still stood. The wind tugged her hair across her face, but she didn't move. Ernst felt the tremor of anger and helplessness twist inside him. The uniforms had passed their judgment and left. But the true war, the one fought without weapons, only glances and gestures, still burned quietly behind the wire.